Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Tamara Thorpe, and I am excited to be here today as the host of our podcast for Making Connections, a handbook for effective formal mentoring in academia. Today, I am here with Laura Gale Lunsford, who is the author of Chapter 13, Improving Mentoring Relationships and Programs through Assessment and Evaluation. Laura is an expert on mentoring and leadership. She is a U.S. Fulbright scholar and authored the seminal Mentors Guide, the second edition for designing successful mentoring programs. She co-edited the SAGE Handbook of Mentoring and co-authored faculty development in liberal arts colleges, in addition to authoring over 50 peer-reviewed articles and chapters. Her work has been funded by the NSF, the Department of Education, the Luce Foundation, and the Institute for Education Sciences. And she has what impressive already. She's also received the Hope Dissertation Award from the International Mentoring Association and serves as a board member for the IMA, and is a professor of psychology at Campbell University, where she is also the assistant dean in the School of Education and Human Sciences. Her PhD is from NC State, and she is the co-founder of Lead Mentor Develop. So hello, Laura, welcome.
Thank you, Tamara. It's great to be here with you. You can tell I like to talk about mentoring and write about mentoring.
Yeah, and I mean, really impressive. We're in great hands today to have this conversation about evaluation and assessment and how they really contribute to mentoring. But if we could start with you telling us what has inspired the work that you do in mentoring research, and then specifically the work that you do around assessment and evaluation.
Well, assessment and evaluation sounds so boring, but I find it exciting. And how I got into mentoring really is traced back to my dissertation. I remember when my advisor said, hey, you need to get on this super highway out of here, time to pick an idea. And I spent the summer cycling through ideas, and none of them really seemed that interesting to me. And I have a mentor at the American Psychological Association, Irina Sabatnik. She's still there, and she's over the education directorate. And we talked a lot about what would be interesting topic, and we got talking about mentoring. And at the time, a lot of work had been done on mentoring, but it was in the business literature. So it was, if you had a mentor, you were more satisfied, got promoted more, but no one really knew a lot about how people got together, the psychology of it. And so I was quite interested in how do people get together, stay together, and what are those actual outcomes in other settings than just business? So I have found that to be a pretty exciting sort of lifelong journey so far. And really got interested in assessment. My background is in applied social and community psychology, and evaluation and assessment is a big part of that work. I think of mentoring as an intervention, and people spend a lot of time in it. And I became very interested in, what makes that, again, work well, and how can we help people develop the skills to know that. I find often people have a program and they get people together and expect good things will happen. And sometimes it does, but often it doesn't. And so that assessment and evaluation is that sort of magic glue that can enhance it for everyone. So ends up people are very interested in that topic, and here we are.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I am somebody who's always been quite fascinated with assessment and evaluation. And I think that's because I'm just fascinated with learning, and I see them as such a key component to learning. And so your chapter focuses specifically on differentiating assessment and evaluation, provides some great frameworks and clarity on how we incorporate it. And certainly the chapters that precede your chapter speak to evaluation and how it's important and why it's important. But can you, from your perspective, share with us, this is going to be a big question, so I apologize in advance.
Get ready. Do I need to write this down?
What's the difference between the two, and why is it important that both are a part of the process?
That is a great question, and I will preface it by saying people often also think it means they have to do research studies, which you don't. Research is just a totally different effort. And so also sort of separating that out from assessment and evaluation. And a lot of people are familiar with the terms formative and summative, and I think it's a nice way to line it up. So formative assessment is assessment that's happening while mentoring is going on or your mentoring program is going on. And you can use that information to tweak things, make things better, get rid of things maybe that aren't working. And I think of that formative piece as really lining up with this idea of assessment. And that can be of relationships. So people can do it on their own, like how's our relationship going? I have a lot of mentees and we meet weekly in labs, and I will often say, what do we need to do more of? What do I need to do differently? How are we doing achieving your goals? So that's sort of that informal formative assessment. Evaluation, on the other hand, is when it's all done. You can't change it now, maybe for next time, but evaluation also lines up with this idea of summative. So it's after it's all done, and what evidence do you have that your program worked or didn't work, and what elements might need to be tweaked. So I think sort of thinking of it from those perspectives really helps people understand the difference.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you do distinguish them both from research, and chapter 14 certainly goes into detail about how to take what you do from about an evaluation process and advance that into research. So I like that this chapter really focuses on that assessment and evaluation. And one of the things that you mentioned early on that quite intrigued me is this idea of theory of change and how it connects to evaluation. I think to myself, how much I've written about evaluation and assessment and how much evaluation I've conducted. And perhaps it was happening implicitly, but to be so explicit about connecting your theory of change to evaluation to me was quite a revelation. So can you talk a little bit about the theory, the idea of theory of change in mentoring and the role it plays in evaluation?
Great, another great question. And I think people often don't think about their theory of change necessarily. And at the end of the day, for mentoring programs and mentoring relationships, we are hoping people are going to be different. And part of a lot of the work that I do is to help people make those implicit ideas really explicit. You know, what is the goal? How are they going to be different? And then what are they talking about or doing that's going to achieve that goal? Because when mentoring programs aren't effective, it's often that people are getting together and people have an idea of the goal, but they may have their own goals that are different from the program itself. So I might get a lot out of it, but it didn't at all achieve the mentoring program's goals. And so really helping people use a tool I call the logic model. The Kellogg Foundation has published some great resources on this. This comes right out of a lot of evaluation work that really makes you make each step very explicit, and often sort of working from here's your resources on one side to what are your ultimate overarching goals, and then sort of backing up from those goals. Well, what are the outcomes that are going to drive those goals? And then what are the activities that you are doing or your program is doing that's going to drive that? As I've done more of this work, I've done a lot of workshops. In fact, I sat down with a colleague on my campus the other day who said, I need to design this mentoring program. I have no idea how to do it. And I pulled up the logic model template and we could talk it through about, well, what are your goals? Well, what are you going to hope they do? And now I color code it. So it really helps people see, gosh, I have a goal, but I don't have any activities that are going to drive the attainment of that goal. And we can think about this in education with maybe there's a goal around retention for first-year students, but nobody ever really talked about resources on campus. And that was an important piece of their theory of change. Well, if they know more about them, they'll take advantage of tutoring and that will keep them in. So thinking really deeply about what's going to be happening that makes it different, and then how you can use those activities as part of your plan to assess and evaluate just makes it such a tight framework and lets you identify if something's not working, where the intervention. So maybe many things about the mentoring program's working, but this one piece, which was really important, didn't happen, and that's what the problem was. So I like thinking about theory of change and helping people think very explicitly about their ideas of that and what they think people are going to be doing and talking about.
Yeah, I know for myself, it really connected a lot of dots as I was reading through and recognizing how powerful, because so often for folks who don't come from a background or have a lot of experience with evaluation and assessment, I hear from my clients all the time, well, what do we ask? And that theory of change and that logic model really simplifies what to ask. And I think that's one of the pieces of your chapter I really appreciated, because so often in our attempts, right, with the best of intentions to evaluate, we might not even be capturing the right data.
That's such a great observation. And I often work with people on that. Often we inherit a program and they're just recycling the same survey that somebody gave last year, which may or may not really capture the key parts that you need to be thinking about. And often are just asking a lot of questions and then wonder why nobody's filling it out. Well, it's too long, it doesn't seem relevant. And so getting a tighter framework also lets you just be more efficient. To collect, not be swimming in data that you don't know what to do with, but to really get the information that's going to be useful to make good judgments and decisions about what to do next time.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because so often, right, folks will send out a survey, it's got 20 questions. You probably only really need 3 of those questions to really gather the data that is going to validate your theory of change. Because, right, isn't that really what you want your evaluation questions to do?
Absolutely. In fact, I was brainstorming with a colleague last night. We were talking about he's working to create some mentoring programs for people with disabilities. And we were talking about, well, what's your goal? And he wanted to have students from 12 to 20 in it. And we got talking about professional development and how that might look really different for someone who's 18 than for, say, a 13-year-old. And then what are they going to be doing that's going to let them show they gained those skills? And he was like, oh, that's right. Yeah, I need to kind of think about what are those activities. And then that's what you want to collect data about, not necessarily how often did they meet or what did they, was it by text or phone? I mean, you want to collect some dosage, like how much did they interact, certainly, but I'm really getting down to what is it that's happening and how I can get some data on that.
Yeah, that's great. And so it does, it just, when you have that theory of change and that logic model, it really does start to sort of fill in the blanks and answer those questions that earlier might have been challenging for you in terms of what do I evaluate, what do I ask for, and so I think that that's key. Now, one of the things that you do talk about in terms of frameworks, particularly, is this idea of the mentoring ecosystem. And I'm going to confess that you provide an incredible visual in your chapter, and I hope folks really enjoy how well you walk us through. But can you talk with me about this idea of this mentoring ecosystem, and then particularly sort of how it lays out with that visual? Because I struggled a little bit with the visual. I'm not going to lie, Laura. I looked at it and I understood conceptually, theoretically, but what is this mentoring ecosystem and the parts that make it up?
Well, thank you for asking that. Often we look at people, and when we do evaluation and mentoring programs, we're looking at the relationship. And and often we'll ask mentees questions. Sometimes we ask mentors questions, not always. But what the mentoring ecosystem says is, okay, first of all, these people arrive with certain backgrounds, and that might be important to collect information on their baseline. So for example, if they have some prior experiences or skills or even motivations, it might be helpful to know where they start, because you might have a lot of change, but they were already pretty high to begin with, and you wouldn't know that if you don't ask at the beginning. So part of what this is suggesting is get a baseline for where people are, to kind of have a sense about how much difference it is. The other thing is, when people fail to get a baseline, some research has shown that people who actually get more mentoring have worse outcomes. which is a bit counterintuitive. But if you look at the baseline data, it's because they started at a worse point. So yes, they are doing worse relative to the people who got less mentoring, but they actually needed more mentoring and they had more gains. But if you don't get that baseline, you don't know that. And you could think, oh no, my program is messing people up, when in fact, quite the opposite's happening. So part of it is recognizing they're coming in with information, but also that people sit in a system and that those relationships unfold over time. And so assessing that relationship at the beginning is going to look very different than at a midpoint or even at an ending point. And so this recognition of this sort of over time, these relationship stages is really important. And are they moving through those stages? And how do you have some data to know that, okay, they've moved past rapport building and now they're collaborating and, getting the work of the relationship done. The other idea is that looking at these resources and that mentoring exists in this sort of ecosystem, whether it's a department or a school, and what kind of supports are there that are supporting good mentoring and effective mentoring? Do you have safety nets? Is there some mentorship training? So it also says, look, it's not just those relationships, but looking at the infrastructure in that system that is supporting mentoring is also an important part for sustainability for mentoring programs. And that's also going to include things like the program manager. Is there one? What kind of technology is there? I'm working increasingly with online mentoring programs, and how's that going to be sustained? And when thinking about faculty, it's norms and policies maybe. I've worked with colleagues on studies where we've actually looked at all the tenure and promotion documents for faculty at schools, for example, who say they really value undergraduate research, and a remarkably small number of those documents talk about undergraduate research. So kind of having this idea of also looking at those contexts and assessing, does your program, is it well supported? Maybe we need to make some changes in those contexts? So that ecosystem is suggesting there's more that to look at than just the two people and did they like talking to each other and achieve some outcome.
That's so helpful. And I think I appreciate that because there are so many factors and looking at this through a systems thinking lens, I think is really helpful because they all do impact one another, and a small shift in one part of the system can really either enhance or disrupt the entire system. You also talk about different tools for assessment. And I was wondering if you could, because certainly as I've talked with different authors about evaluation and assessment, there is this sort of push and pull between qualitative and quantitative data. Is qualitative data valuable?
Well, I would say it is valuable. The challenge can be, though, if people get so much qualitative data, they're kind of swimming in it and they don't know how to make sense of it. And so what I often recommend is that qualitative data, which is like free responses on a survey or interviews or observation, is really useful, especially in the beginning, and you don't know what to ask. But as your program develops and you have a better sense of that, you should be less qualitative information because you kind of know now what people's responses are. So make it easier for them to fill out your evaluation surveys by having those, and then you can have other and a free response. So qualitative certainly also provides enrichment and depth. And part of what I advocate is for people to pull together and sort of tell their success story of their program. So having some quotes from people or your own observations can really enrich those numbers. So I think you really do need both, but it might be more qualitative in the beginning, and it should certainly be much less as the program's been going.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because I put a lot of value on qualitative research, qualitative evaluation and assessment and inquiry. And I know that you can easily get overwhelmed with an abundance of data. And that certainly is something I learned through my research process of being so sort of judicious with that. And one of the things you just mentioned, right, is you may use it early on. And one of the things you talk about early on is creating safety nets for mentees. So what is the safety net that you're referring to, and how does that connect to assessment?
Well, part of assessment is you want those relationships to be effective. And if you wait until the end to ask them, maybe it wasn't going so well, but you never knew. And I often advocate that people, as part of their assessment and evaluation effort, is to have a check-in period, say within the first month of the program, just to make sure, did people get connected? Do they need to be rematched? Is there a need for some graceful exits? And so having this check-in period gives you some important feedback. How's your matching going? Do we need to change something about selection if we're having high failure rates? There are always going to be some failure rate. That's to be expected. People are human, things happen. But if it's really high, you'd be concerned, and it's helpful to have a check-in to be able to monitor that information. But it also then lets you intervene on the relationship if it's not going well. And so it really can be as simple a question as, we're checking in. Did you meet? Some people I advocate, would you like to be rematched with someone else? Do you have a plan for meeting? Is there something that I need to be aware of? And then people will volunteer if there's a problem. So having that check-in is an important part of that safety net.
Yeah, I appreciated that. I thought it was something that, we might think of at some stage, hopefully early on, but we might also forget as program managers or coordinators are trying to get a program off the ground, and often so grateful that it's off the ground that folks can skip that step, and it is so important to create that safety net. I like how you articulated that. Now, one of the things that you also do in your chapter is provide quite a few models and tools, and you talk about contracts, and you also share a new model for evaluation. And so can you just share with us how important are these sort of tools, having contracts, having models, logic models, and models for evaluation, and having these tools? What role do tools play in ensuring successful mentoring programs?
Well, first of all, I'm super impressed that you read that chapter and remember it. You must be an evaluation nerd like me. And I think what the tools do a couple of things. One is what I've tried to provide are tools that have either been used a lot, so we have some evidence of their effectiveness. And there's also inventories that do have some research behind them to show that they're good inventories. They're measuring what you think they're going to measure. People are going to give similar responses to those measures. So don't reinvent the wheel is a big message. It's like use some validated tools if they're close enough or good enough, because one, it saves you time. It also just lets you benchmark. Again, you don't have to do research, but it just gives you a benchmark. Well, how is my program maybe doing compared to others? And so the time savings, the effectiveness of the evaluation, it's really difficult to write good questions. And so if you don't have to do that, don't. And tools just make that more efficient, let you use things that are going to show more effectiveness.
Yeah, that's great. I think one of the things that I'm mindful of, particularly my role as a consultant when I'm working with clients, is how quick people are to reinvent the wheel, right? And sometimes folks might be hesitant to use something that's somebody else has used because they think, is this going to fit? But it is a good reminder that very often those tools that are and resources that are readily available can at least be inspirational, right? And so that we aren't just starting from scratch, particularly with things that have been researched and validated, and we know that they work. So that's so helpful. So I want us to kind of put ourselves in the minds of a program manager who maybe, as you have said, folks that you've been meeting with who are launching a mentoring program for the first time. Or they're in the early stages of reinventing a mentoring program, or they've been handed one, they've inherited one. And so when it comes to assessment and evaluation, what do you think is something that is a must-have, right? Maybe I can't do everything, but what is something that I must have as part of my mentoring program as it relates to evaluation and assessment?
I think a must-have when we're talking about that is really laying out your theory of change, whether that's using the logic model tool or some other representation, is getting very clear for your stakeholders and participants, what are the goals and what are we doing that's going to help achieve those goals. That would be the number one recommendation for new program or redesigning, or even inheriting one and you're just trying to kind of figure it out. Do we still need to do all these activities? Does it all line up?
Great. That's great. Thank you for reinforcing that. I'm selfishly for myself. I'm thinking, thank you for reinforcing that and making sure to really drive that through. What's a nice to have?
Nice to have would be, a couple of points where you are collecting some of that data that's more than just the start and the end. So some kind of midpoint or check-in, whether that's a formal or informal, maybe it's at an event where everybody's coming. So it's nice to have that kind of touch point, and because it signals that you're interested as a program manager or coordinator. And it also, I find that it motivates people to stay meeting and doing and reminding them, oh yeah, I can't tell you the number of times when I schedule, maybe I often do webinars for programs on training, and we do it throughout the year. And they're like, this really motivated me to reach back out and so forth. So those kind of check-ins are really nice to have.
That's great. That's great. And as we move forward and think about all that we have, what can we live without?
We could probably live without asking a ton of questions. So people do ask a lot of stuff, and maybe you're not going to use all of that. And so we can probably let go of some of the and maybe anxiety about, gosh, I need to collect stuff on everything. No, you don't.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I know a couple of years ago, we were launching a program and we had somebody who was very research focused, works at a research institution, and created this survey that was so extensive. And, we really had to challenge, right? How important is it to ask all of these questions, and can we bring this down to something so specific? And I think folks, particularly folks who might be in higher ed and be in institutions that have a research focus, can feel pressure to have more. But I think often, as you said, right, less can be more and really impactful when we're looking to use that data to really improve the program. Well, I want to thank you for your time today. I confess that I am an assessment and evaluation nerd junkie, somebody who likes to sit in that space, because I really do see it as such a key part of the learning process and such a key aspect of having a program and ensuring that it is successful and meeting your theory of change along the way. So I really enjoyed your chapter. I hope that folks enjoy reading it as much as I do, and that it certainly gives people confidence and a framework to move forward with their assessment and evaluation in their mentoring program. So thank you so much for the incredible work that you have done and for contributing to the book.
Well, I appreciate that. And I hope that's one of the big takeaways is you don't need to have gone to graduate school to do a good job on collecting some information if your program's been successful for people. And the other thought is don't be afraid to ask. Sometimes I encounter people, they're worried the program's a reflection on them, when in fact it's like, but don't you want to know if you could make it better? So just realizing it's not about you, it's about that relationship and the support. And then communicating that back to people and letting them know how you're improving is really what I hope people take away, because we spend a lot of time on programs and we ask people to spend a lot of their time on those relationships, and helping them to use that to maximum benefit is, I think, something you and I and probably many others share a desire for.
Yeah. Thank you for reiterating that. I think folks will see as they read through the handbook that lots of folks heavily advocate for evaluation, and chapter 13 really shows us how to make it happen in a very practical and thoughtful way. So thank you for our conversation today, Laura. Thank you for contributing to the book. We look forward to seeing you all again as you watch and listen in our next podcast. So thank you everybody for watching, and thank you again, Laura.
Thank you.